Hello, everyone. I know folks are coming in and still getting logged in, so we're just going to take a few minutes before we get started. But if you want, go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know your name, where you're coming from, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Actually, I think the chat is disabled, so we're going to get started in just a few minutes, but just know that our Q&A is going to be available throughout the webinar today. So please field all your questions in the Q&A. We'll have plenty of time to answer those throughout our 1 hour and 15-minute webinar. I know folks are still coming in. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to our webinar, FAFSA Fixes for Homeless and Foster Youth. We have an amazing group of panelists here today. We are excited to share information that you need to know regarding the FAFSA for our homeless and foster youth. So this webinar is 1 hour and 15 minutes. Know that you can always jump off at any point in time. You are going to be getting a copy of this webinar recorded and archived, so that will be sent to you right after the webinar is done. Audio is muted, so again, please ask questions through the Q&A portion. We'll have plenty of time to get through that later today. An email will be sent to you later with, again, a recording of this PowerPoint and the webinar as well, and any of the other related resources that we talk about. But to get us started, I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with some introductions. My name is Jillian Sitar, and I'm the Senior Higher Education Program Manager with Schoolhouse Connection. Our Executive Director, Barbara Duffield, will be joining us shortly. But if you aren't familiar with Schoolhouse Connection, we are a national organization based in Washington, D.C., with a mission to overcome homelessness through education. And I'll turn it over to Bryce to introduce himself and talk about the Hope Center.
Thank you, Jillian, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bryce McKibben, the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice at Temple University, or the Hope Center for short. We are a national action research center that focuses on student basic needs in higher education and views students' ability to afford college, the total cost of college, as central to their ability to succeed in higher education. I'm really happy to join with all of my co-panelists today to talk about the importance of assisting students experiencing homelessness or experiencing foster care. And I'll turn it to Debbie.
Hi, I'm Debbie Rauscher, the Director of Education at John Burton Advocates for Youth. I will be in the background helping to field the Q&A that comes in. We're based in California, focusing on improving outcomes for youth who have experienced homelessness or been in the foster care system. And I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Pokempner from the Youth Law Center. And the Youth Law Center works to transform foster care and juvenile justice systems across the country so that all youth can thrive. And we consider thriving in all aspects and level of education as a key area of our work. We're located in California and do work across the country. And I'll pass it to my colleague, Jasmine.
Hi, my name is Jasmine Miller. I'm a staff attorney at the Youth Law Center, and much of my work focuses on access to higher education for young folks impacted by foster care and juvenile justice systems.
And hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Duffield. I'm Executive Director of Schoolhouse Connection, and I'm thrilled to be with you here today. So just to give a little bit of an overview of our agenda for you today, We're going to spend a little bit of time up top talking about some of the current trends in higher education, specifically as it relates to youth who are experiencing homelessness and youth with experience in foster care. We'll show you some recently released data of FAFSA, for both populations that help illustrate why this is such a critical issue, particularly right now. And then the main item for our presentation today is really to go over these FAFSA simplification updates that are in effect now, most of them, so that you have that information to help the young people that you're working with. And at the end, we will share some resources and we'll have time for Q&A as well. And knowing that there will be a lot of questions, we've planned this to be a longer webinar than usual. So it's 75 minutes, so that we'll be sure to get to the questions, as many as possible in the chat, and then perhaps some live as well.
All right, so just to get us started, most of you already know and understand the value of higher education. Some form of post-secondary education is necessary for a good paying job. So a job which allows folks to stay out of poverty and be able to afford housing. Higher education is also a protective factor against youth homelessness, which was found in a 2019 study by Chapin Hall. However, paying for college is costly, and so that's where financial aid comes in. So students who apply for financial aid increase their likelihood of attending a post-secondary education, and new data found earlier in Washington actually links financial aid and upward mobility. And so they found that all students coming from a low-income household saw an economic status rise within 3 years. But still, we know that there are many students that are currently in school or in college that are experiencing homelessness, and they need that help accessing financial aid. So I'm going to pass it over to Bryce to share a little bit about what we know about those students currently in college.
Thanks, Jillian. Our conversation today is occurring at a very timely moment in higher education, when students across the country are experiencing really alarming rates of basic needs insecurity, and have been for several years. So a lot of the fixes we're going to talk about today in the financial aid process and the FAFSA itself will help alleviate some of the most challenging situations that students are facing. The Hope Center has been running a student basic needs survey for well over 5 years at hundreds of colleges across the country. Our most recent data come from fall of 2020 at the height of the pandemic, which despite the significant impacts of COVID-19 actually showed pretty consistent data with previous years. And that was that nearly half of all students in higher education were experiencing some form of housing insecurity, and 14% of students were experiencing homelessness. Based on the most recent data we have about college enrollment nationwide, those percentages would translate to about 7.7 million students in higher education experiencing housing insecurity, and about 2.2 million students experiencing homelessness at our institutions of higher education. We also have significant data on other types of basic needs insecurities that overlap and intersect with these other challenges, obviously food insecurity, lack of ability to afford childcare, transportation, and other essential needs for students. Also important to highlight is the equity implications of these gaps. In the overall basic needs insecurity rate of 3 in 5 students experiencing either food or housing insecurity, Black students experience basic needs insecurity at a rate 16 percentage points higher than white students. So this is also a matter of economic justice and equity, and an essential part of our institution's ability to serve the students who are most in need of assistance. And I will turn it back to Jillian.
Thanks, Bryce, for kind of setting up that context. So in October, we at Schoolhouse released a report which analyzed FAFSA data for homeless and foster youth over the last 8 years. And the results were pretty shocking. In addition to the national data, we also broke it down by state. So if you want to see what trends are happening in your state over the last 8 years, you can visit this link or scan the QR code and read about the report and see what your state is like. And so our first key finding that we found is that in the 2020-2021 academic year, the number of unaccompanied homeless youth determinations declined by almost 10% from the prior year. And this is a really significant large drop, especially in comparison to all number of FAFSA applications that were submitted that year. That was only a 1% decrease. The second finding that we found is that the number of foster youth FAFSA applicants decreased by 7%. So again, higher than that 1% decrease that happened across the whole FAFSA applicants. Our last and third key finding was that the number of youth who requested a FAFSA determination but did not receive a determination increased by 23% from the prior year. And it was 34% from the prior year in 2018. So over these last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic increase of more and more students requesting a determination because they believe they meet the definition of an unaccompanied homeless youth. However, these students aren't receiving the actual determination. And it could be from a variety of different reasons why the determination didn't happen. Maybe they didn't understand the process. Maybe they never received a letter. Maybe they were asked to provide additional documentation, or maybe the student just gave up. So whatever the reason is, we know that there are students that believe that they might meet the definition of an unaccompanied homeless youth, but they fall through the cracks. And we are really hopeful that with these new provisions and guidance, we will be able to help these students. And so on this slide and on this graph here, you can see unaccompanied homeless youth determinations between the 2 years broken down by the different authorized entities. So high school district liaisons continued to make the most amount of unaccompanied homeless youth determinations compared to all the rest of the entities that were listed here. But what's also pretty interesting to note is that financial aid administrators continue to make the least amount of determinations. But we actually know that many of our students aren't identified in high school. They might not be utilizing shelters. And so we actually expect that financial aid administrators should and could be making more of these determinations, which again brings us back to that last key finding that we found on the report. More students are requesting FAFSA determinations, but there's a disconnect because not all those determinations are being met. On this next graph, we see the total amount of unaccompanied homeless youth determinations made by liaisons since 2013. And what I'd like to note here is the direct impact of policy. And so you can see in 2016, there's a little spike. And that's because there was a FAFSA amendment about McKinney-Vento that went into effect, which required liaisons to inform unaccompanied homeless youth about their independent student status and help them fill out the FAFSA. And so right now, again, you can kind of see that for the second year in a row, liaison determinations have declined, but we are hopeful that we'll see an increase for next year as more and more schools are now fully in person. And some of the schools that we've talked to, the liaisons we've talked to, they said that their homeless numbers have doubled, if not more. So we are excited and hopeful to see that increase go back up. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara to kind of level set on when we're talking about homelessness on the FAFSA, what does that actually mean?
So recognizing that there may be a variety of folks on the webinar who may come in at different points of education already on the FAFSA, for youth who are considered unaccompanied homeless youth, or if they're unaccompanied, self-supporting, and at risk of homelessness, those students meet the definition of an independent student for the FAFSA. And what that means is that they do not need to include parental information on the FAFSA. So it's a critical status for these young people. And for those of you who are working in K-12, for example, or with youth who are both with their parents and who are without their parents, the provisions that we're talking about specifically for the FAFSA to meet the definition of independent student is both unaccompanied, not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian, and experiencing homelessness. And this is the education definition of homelessness. So it's the broader definition that includes staying in with other people temporarily because there's nowhere else to go, or staying in motels. Students who are experiencing homelessness, but they're with their parents, they're still considered dependent students, and they would fill out the FAFSA the same way as any other student. And for a little bit of level setting on FAFSA for foster students from foster care, I'll turn it over to Jenny.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so we wanted to talk a little bit about a young person can be considered independent if they were in foster care. And the way that that is identified in the foster care, in the FAFSA is not just foster care were dependent or were a ward of the court at age 13 or older. And I think for many of you on the call, you're familiar with that, but we wanted to highlight a couple of things just to make sure that we're identifying all the students that might be eligible for independent status based on this foster care dependent award of the court. So the first thing we wanted to highlight was that a young person who meets that status doesn't lose it if they enter the juvenile justice system or enter a permanency arrangement. And by permanency arrangement, we just mean leave foster care to guardianship or adoption or another arrangement like that. If they have this status, they don't lose it. So that's just important to note. We also wanted to flag that in many states, a young person who's in the juvenile justice system is also placed in what we call a foster care placement. And so that will mean that they would be eligible under this category as well. So we wanted to highlight to you all who are advocates working with young people, it may not be clear to you if a youth in the juvenile justice system is in a foster care placement. If you have questions about that, please seek assistance, because we do want to make sure all youth who are eligible under this status get the help they need and meet this criteria if they're eligible. So again, that's something that you can reach out to us for. But again, wanted to flag this for advocates who really are working directly with young people. I think I'll pass it back to you, Barbara.
Okay, so now we're on to the main topic of the presentation, which are these provisions with the FAFSA Simplification Act. Just a little bit of understanding where these wins came from. Jillian went over the data, and we know our foster care and juvenile justice partners have data too about the major barriers that youth face in accessing the FAFSA. We also work directly with the network of educators and service providers who see these barriers every day. And of course, we have a youth leadership and scholarship program where the barriers are very, very real to us. But getting the changes in the FAFSA that we're going to talk about today took over 10 years. And that happens with persistence, but it also happens with amazing congressional champions. And for example, U.S. Senator Patty Murray, who really fought for this, and amazing congressional staff who work for senators and who work for Congress. And we're thrilled today that Bryce McKibben with the Hope Center, who was part of one of the authors and congressional champion that got these changes through, is now working with us at the Hope Center to make sure that they're implemented, because the implementation is often where the real work comes. So just wanted to let you know how thrilled we are to be working with Bryce and the Hope Center to carry over the congressional intent into the implementation work.
Thanks, Barbara. It's a real honor to be in partnership and community with all of you working to support students experiencing homelessness and former foster youth. The FAFSA Simplification Act really came together at an intersection of both the persistence Barbara mentioned around provisions specific to students experiencing homelessness and foster youth, and an effort to simplify the FAFSA that began in 2014 as bipartisan members of Congress looked for ways to reduce the overall length of the FAFSA form and to simplify some of the financial aid processes that students experience on the back end that affects all types of applicants and can really make completing the form a challenge. But we are focused on implementing these wins now, but it's important to note that it's occurring both in phases, as well as some things that might not be completely obvious to folks just from either filling out the FAFSA or even surfing studentaid.gov and trying to look for the various changes that are in effect. The Department of Education has announced that it will complete implementation of all of the changes of the FAFSA Simplification Act by the end of the 24-25 award year. An award year runs from July 1 through June 30th of each year. However, for the provisions we're talking about today, the ones that benefit and simplify the process for unaccompanied homeless youth and foster youth, those provisions are in effect as we speak. They take effect, they are applicable to the 23-24 award year, but as students are filling out the FAFSA right now, the one that went online October 1, these process changes needed to be in effect now for the students to effectively enroll. And we mention that because it's important to note that these are happening before the rest of some of the other changes accompanying the FAFSA Simplification Act. Also, due to some unfortunate timing, the actual form on FAFSA.gov or studentaid.gov that students and families are filling out, the text of the questions, as you'll see in a couple of slides, has not actually changed to reflect what students can, the full range of the benefits to students and their ability to fill out the form. So what they see online and what they can look up and when they select checkboxes and so forth does not actually map to the full expanded eligibility and pathways that are available to them. And as a result, financial aid administrators are going to be a key part of making sure that students can actually get the determination of independence that they deserve. Once the Department of Education has had a chance to fully implement the FAFSA for the 24-25 award year, the form should be updated at that point to make sure that it fully reflects all of the expanded sources of determination and the process benefits, excuse me, that were contained in the law. And go to the next slide. Just to situate everybody really quickly in sort of where we are in the simplification process, as I mentioned, it's being completed through the next 2 years. We are at the point where a number of these benefits are kicking off, but are happening at the same time of some other things that could have an indirect impact on unaccompanied homeless youth and former foster youth. For example, this year, questions related to drug conviction or selective service have been removed from the FAFSA. That's often a huge tripping point for students, a huge barrier to higher education. Students who are incarcerated will be eligible for Pell again for prison education programs beginning next summer. There are some changes related to cost of attendance, which can have a benefit. Students are also coming online. Department of Education has put out guidance related to this, which we will touch on. But then just to sort of crystallize what I was saying about what happens in the following award year, some of the biggest reforms to the actual formula that benefits students, how Pell Grants get calculated, the change to replace what has been long called the expected family contribution, but isn't really that, is going to become the student aid index. And some of the ways that students transfer their tax information, all of that will be coming online in 24-25. So we are right in the middle of a major simplification process, but still worthy of talking about some of the changes that are in effect right now. Go to the next slide. One of the biggest changes and benefits that are in effect right now are that homeless and foster youth do not need to be redetermined as being unaccompanied homeless youth or foster youth each year. There is a presumption that if a student has answered that they are they do fall into one of those categories and are determined to be independent, that that determination will carry forward to the next year. And this will actually happen in the FAFSA itself. So a student who's previously indicated, for example, in the 22-23 award year that just finished, that they were an unaccompanied homeless youth or foster youth, their answer in that form as they log in now or over the course of the next couple of months to fill out the FAFSA will be pre-populated and carried forward for the 23-24 award year. It'll just, where the student would normally have to select a box, yes, I am experiencing homelessness, or no, that will be pre-populated for the student, and they will then be asked to reconfirm that in fact is still the case for them. They will have the option to say, no, I am no longer experiencing homelessness, but the box itself will be pre-populated for the students. The schools themselves do have the option under the law and have for a while now to ask students if their status has changed, but it would be a recommended practice from our point of view that the schools not necessarily create an additional hurdle for students, as again, the student is already being asked this question in the FAFSA of whether or not their status is still applicable. Also a note that financial aid administrators and schools in general are not permitted under the law to hinder or delay the awarding of federal financial aid through requiring additional documentation or processes or steps for students to fill out, unless there is some indication of conflicting information about the student's status. This is a codification of what was practiced under the previous guidance into law, which means that it is very important that schools follow this directive. Otherwise, they could be subject to a program review or other enforcement or oversight action related to their financial aid process. Next slide. It's also important to note that there are some improvements and some guidelines to the timeline for students to be able to get their determinations from their financial aid administrator and be actually made to have a determination of independence. Obviously, the determinations should and must be made as quickly as practicable. They cannot be delayed, as we just talked about. But there is a hard deadline of no later than 60 days after the student enrolls. So if a student were enrolling in mid-August, the determination process would need to be completed 60 days thereafter, which would be mid-October. However, a best practice would be, and one that's permitted by the law, for a student to receive their determination as early as the award year for which the student submits the application. So for example, a student might be filling out the FAFSA as we speak, or very soon for enrollment in an academic year starting next summer or fall. There's no reason for that a school would have to wait to make a determination of independence. So the student might fill out the financial aid form, and then the financial aid administrator could go ahead and process the student's determination of homelessness to make sure that they get an accurate financial aid picture and accurate financial aid offer before they enroll, rather than having to wait and deal with all of the paperwork and process requirements that might be required in a very busy time of fall of 2023. The reason why these changes have been made is that delays in disbursement of aid have historically exacerbated the financial hardship that students experiencing homelessness or foster care youth have experienced, and can often lead them to disenroll from higher education because they don't have the financial resources to be able to afford the bills that are coming due. Now, a couple of other changes to benefit students are the parties that can actually verify a student's experiencing, or students who are experiencing homelessness and therefore qualification as an unaccompanied homeless youth, or a student who is unaccompanied and at risk of homelessness. Before, it was tightly limited to largely McKinney-Vinfield liaisons at the K-12 level, transfers that were funded by HUD, or if no other sources were available, the financial aid administrator themselves. That has been expanded, and as you see here, the text in bold are the new options for students. So a school district liaison at K-12 level could designate someone at the school to serve in their capacity and provide the determination. A emergency or transitional shelter or the designee of a director of that shelter does not have to be HUD funded in order for a student to receive a determination from that source. And street outreach programs or homeless youth drop-in centers or any other program serving individuals who are experiencing homelessness can serve as an authorized entity to verify that a student is experiencing homelessness. Let me repeat that again. Any individual working for a street outreach program, homeless youth drop-in center, or other program can serve as a verification entity for the student experiencing homelessness, just as long as they are in touch with the director of the program as they serve and are a designee of that program to be able to help the student enroll in higher education. Other sources are TRIO and Gear Up programs who serve millions of students each year. The directors of those programs or designee can serve as authorized entities, and financial aid administrators at another institution, say if a student's transferring between schools, can also serve as an authorized entity. Now, I just want to quickly show or crystallize what is actually being seen by students and applicants on the screen, on the FAFSA screen itself. As I mentioned, unfortunately, the FAFSA has not been formally updated to reflect those sources of determination that we just described. So the page that students are faced with after they answer that they are experiencing homelessness still looks like it did during the 22-23 award year. Ask about a school district or homeless liaison, the shelter, or the director of a runaway homeless youth basic center. If a student has one of the sources, though, that has been expanded, say a TRIO or Gear Up director, or a shelter that is not funded by HUD, at this time, they will have to select none of the above. And then they will proceed to follow up with the financial aid administrator at their institution to receive the determination. It used to be that when a student selected none of the above, that was the only thing they could then do was seek a determination from their financial aid administrator because they didn't have any other authorized documentation to verify or from a verified source. That is different now. None of the above either leads to a student using one of the newly authorized sources or seeking a determination of independence from their financial aid administrator. I know that's pretty confusing, so just wanted to make sure folks could see it. And then finally, just wanted to reemphasize that a financial aid administrator who sees a student check none of the above, but then comes to the financial aid office with one of the newly authorized entities, the financial administrator, like before under guidance and now codified into law, must accept documentation from one of these authorized entities unless there is a conflicting information. So again, if a student comes with authorization from a director of a TRIO or GEAR Up program stating that they are in fact a student experiencing homelessness and qualify as an unaccompanied homeless youth, the financial aid administrator must accept that determination. And this could be in various forms that are spelled out in the law, either a phone call that's documented from by the financial aid administrator, a written statement from one of the parties, or a verifiable electronic data match, which occurs in some states, particularly ones that have databases related to students' enrollment, for example, in a foster care program, although this is probably a little bit more applicable to that population. If a student doesn't have one of the authorized sources, again, it's just like it used to under guidance, but now codified. The financial aid administrator must make a determination of whether the student qualifies as an unaccompanied homeless youth if that it is requested by the student. And that's an overview of what FAFSA Simplification Act changes are that are in effect now, and I will turn it back to Jenny.
Great, thanks so much, Bryce. Yeah, we wanted to highlight in some of the changes with respect to documentation for young people with experience in foster care. And again, similar to what Bryce just discussed, this is really intended to create more opportunities and make it easier for youth to document their status and make it less burdensome for that to occur. So in terms of the documentation that the financial aid administrator must accept, I'm going to share a couple of those. First would be verification of eligibility for education and training vouchers under the Chafee program. Youth already have to prove eligibility for former foster care status in that situation, so that is sufficient. Also, a court order or official state documentation of the student's experience in foster care is acceptable. A documented phone call or written statement from an attorney, guardian ad litem, or CASA. Some of you on the call might serve in that in that relationship, and what's required in those situations would be that you are describing the student's current or former foster care status and then your relationship to the student. And then a documented phone call or written statement from a financial aid administrator. So similar to what Bryce just discussed, a former determination for this year, the past year that was made would also be acceptable. And also, as Bryce said, the possibility that in the foster care context that there would be a data match or data match system in place. California is one state. There's a couple of others who have data matches, which means that the higher education system and child welfare agency are sharing data. And in those situations, the financial aid administrator is able to verify the student's current or former foster care status. And in those situations, that's sufficient, and the student shouldn't be asked, and there should be no need for any additional documentation. So states that, and hopefully we'll have more states moving to having those types of data matches, which really will make it a lot easier, both for the financial aid officers, but also for young people. I'll pass it back to you, I think, Barbara.
Okay, so now to switch to talk about the responsibilities of financial aid administrators. If a young person cannot get a determination from one of the other entities that Bryce described, financial aid administrators must make determinations for those unaccompanied homeless youth. Now, this may be somewhat familiar to you if you've worked in for this issue before, if you're a financial aid administrator. The big difference with the provisions here is that now they are codified. They are in the law. It is not on page 1009 of the ABG or whatever page it's on. It's actually in the statute. So if a young person can't get a determination for one of those other entities, the financial aid administrator must make a determination. That determination must be based on a written statement from or a document that confirms that the student is an unaccompanied homeless youth or a youth who is unaccompanied, at risk, and self-supporting. These determinations also have to be made on the legal definition of homelessness and unaccompanied that are contained in the McKinney-Vento Act, and not based on why the student is in this situation. So it's not about what happened to them. It's not about what happened to their family. It's not about whether they have any contact with their parents, for example, which is something that we hear quite a bit, is do they meet that legal definition of homelessness and unaccompanied, or do they meet the criteria for at risk and self-supporting? In order to help facilitate this process for financial aid administrators, we have created a tool. There's a hyperlink there. Again, those of you who've been working for a while on this issue may know that the National Center for Homeless Ed, our partners who are the Department of Education's TA Center, had a financial aid administrator tool to help those administrators make a determination based on a documented interview, to have some sort of paperwork to put in the student's file. That form is being updated, but we know there's students that are filling out their FAFSA now, and we wanted to make sure that there was a tool that's ready. So we have a very similar tool that's a Google Doc that you can hyperlink there, or that you can share with your financial aid administrators that you're working with, so that they have something to be to ask students that goes through what the law says, but also what the way you could ask about homelessness in a sensitive way to get just enough information to make that determination. And on the next slide, I will turn it over to Jasmine.
Hello. So we are going to turn to talking about dependency overrides for unusual circumstances. Now, those of you who have worked in financial aid for a while will be familiar with this general concept. So it's not new, but it definitely is improved. First, we're just going to talk about what it is, and then we'll get to some of the changes that have been made. So what is a dependency override? Sometimes there are situations in which a student does not qualify as an independent student under the normal independent student grounds, such as the homeless foster youth categories that we've just been talking about, being married, being a veteran, having legal dependents who you're supporting, etc. So they don't qualify as an independent student under those normal grounds, but they still can't provide parental information on the FAFSA. Now, if the reason that a student cannot get parental information for the FAFSA is that they cannot contact their parent, or it would be unsafe for them to contact their parent, they can ask for a dependency override. So they can submit documentation to a financial aid officer who will make a case-by-case determination about whether that student should be considered independent due to unusual circumstances. What are unusual circumstances? An unusual circumstance is one, again, in which a student cannot contact a parent, or it would be unsafe for them to do so. So some examples of unusual circumstances include, but are not limited to, parental abandonment or estrangement, human trafficking, separation from a parent due to immigration processes, a student or parental incarceration, or other circumstances such as parental incapacitation or abuse and neglect. And just to be really clear, because I think someone has already kind of asked this question in the chat. So it's not enough just that a student says, my parent doesn't want to fill out a FAFSA. That on its own is not an unusual circumstance. However, if the reason that that parent does not want to provide parental information is related to parental abandonment or estrangement, abuse or neglect, et cetera, that student could ask for a dependency override. So whenever you're running into a situation where a young person says, my parent won't provide information on the FAFSA, that's a cue to ask some more questions to that young person about the reasons why that is not possible. So again, like if it's that the parent has not been in contact with the student for a really long time, has not been providing support to the student, they're estranged, that would be a reason to request a dependency override. But just a parent saying, no, I don't want to put my information in would not be grounds for a dependency override. Dependency overrides are a really helpful tool for youth who may have experiences very similar to those of unaccompanied homeless youth and foster youth, but who might fall just outside the definition. So for example, you might be working with a youth who was in foster care at the age of 12 and then was reunified with their family of origin. But then in high school, they moved out to live with a relative because the home situation started to deteriorate, but they weren't re-entered into foster care. Okay, so that student wouldn't fall under the normal foster care definition because they weren't in care after the age of 13. However, they would potentially be able to ask for this dependency override. Another example might be a youth who was removed by Child Protective Services and placed with a relative, but Child Protective Services never actually filed a court case. And so the youth has never actually been entered into foster care. That's a that would be another situation in which a young person might want to ask for a dependency override under the grounds that they are experiencing abuse and neglect, and it's not safe for them to be in contact with their parent. Those of you who work with immigrant youth who may be separated from their parents due to immigration processes, but who are not involved in the foster care system may find dependency overrides useful, as well as any of you who work with youth impacted by the juvenile justice system. Many youth in the juvenile justice system have very similar experiences to their peers in foster care, but may never have had the kind of contact with the child welfare system that would qualify them for independent student status under the foster youth eligibility criteria. Okay, moving on. We just wanted to show you what the FAFSA now displays when a student indicates that they cannot provide parental information. We know that this is special and not unusual. There's been some confusion about the terminology, and the Department of Ed is working to implement the new changes. But what's important for you to know is just that what's being referred to here is what we're talking about right now, which is dependency overrides for unusual circumstances. So you'll see highlighted here, these are some examples. Again, these are examples. These are examples of unusual circumstances. It's not a closed list where if your unusual circumstance is not listed here, it means that you cannot ask for a dependency override. But students who might fall into these categories should feel empowered to ask for a dependency override. And on the next slide, we couldn't fit the information that's going to show up on the FAFSA onto one slide. So this is just a continuation of what you'll see on that screen if a young person indicates that they can't provide parental information due to unusual circumstances. So here you'll see highlighted that there's a reminder to look at whether or not a young person might qualify as an unaccompanied homeless youth. And that's there just to make sure that young people who fall into that category are pursuing independent student status through the unaccompanied homeless youth determination and not the dependency override. Why is that? So as we talked about on sort of the first slide about this, dependency overrides are a case-by-case determination, as opposed to unaccompanied homeless youth or foster youth determinations, where if you provide certain documentation, the financial aid administrator must provide you independent student status. So that process for unaccompanied homeless youth and foster youth is just generally going to be easier for a young person than pursuing, and a little bit more straightforward than pursuing a dependency override. So again, when we are working with young people who are having various kinds of unusual circumstances or instability in the home, and you're just trying to figure out, okay, like how is it that I can get them to fill out the FAFSA so that they don't have to provide parental information because that's not feasible. You really want to make sure that you're screening young people for that unaccompanied homeless youth category and potential former involvement in the foster care system. And if a youth can't meet either of those categories, then you would look at a dependency override. Okay, and the next slide. So for this year, if students want to pursue a dependency override, they will need to indicate an unusual circumstance on the FAFSA, they'll need to submit it, and then contact the financial aid office to request an override. That information is on that FAFSA screenshot that we just shared. They will then need to provide documentation of unusual circumstances in accordance with school policy. After that, the school will make their case-by-case determination of whether or not that student should be considered independent. For this year, the student's FAFSA will not be considered complete until the financial aid office has made the override, meaning that students will not receive their student aid report until the override has been completed. So that means that if you're working with a young person who is in this situation where they are submitting a FAFSA indicating that they can't provide parental information due to unusual circumstances, you want to follow up immediately with the financial aid offices that that young person is applying to, at the schools that they're applying to make sure that that dependency override process is getting started, because the student just will not have a completed FAFSA until the financial aid office has completed that process. Now, I promised that there are some improvements to this process. So here they are. Really big picture, financial aid administrators now have a lot more guidance to follow for dependency overrides. The new guidelines are meant to increase transparency and communication about dependency overrides with the goal of making them more accessible to students. So for instance, I said just now that students have to provide documentation of their unusual circumstances in accordance with school policy. And that in itself is actually a change. Financial aid administrators are now explicitly required to have a policy for how they grant dependency overrides. They can't just have a policy where they say, we don't consider those kinds of requests. They are required to have a policy for how they consider these requests for dependency overrides. And their policy should include specifically dependency overrides for unusual circumstances that include abandonment, student or parental incarceration, trafficking, and separation due to refugee or asylee processes. And again, this is a change from before where financial aid officers might have more discretion to say, well, we don't think that, incarceration is an unusual circumstance, so we're just not going to deal with this. Now they do have to consider abandonment, student parent incarceration, trafficking, and separation due to refugee asylee processes, in addition to other circumstances, as examples of unusual circumstances. They have to actually communicate their policy to students, and they have to provide dependency determination as soon as practicable. And on the slide, you'll note a little bit more detail on that section. They have to retain documentation related to the dependency override. And next year, if that same student indicates that they need a dependency override, the financial aid office needs to rely on their past determination unless circumstances have changed. So that means that the student isn't every year having to submit the same documentation over and over again to show that they are qualified for that dependency override, so long as they are at the same institution. I did want to note that if students transfer to new institutions, the new financial aid office now has the ability to rely on the past institution's dependency override, so they can call over and ask the past institution to confirm the circumstances of the dependency override and go ahead and just grant that based off of the past institution granting a dependency override. However, I will note that they're not required to use that past determination. It's just that they are now explicitly allowed to do so. And if you are a financial aid administrator, we would definitely encourage you to utilize that policy. It saves you work, and it also saves students a lot of work. All right. And now we are going to talk about something that is happening next year. So this is a preview. So in that last slide, I talked about how students have to contact their financial aid administrator in order to get a dependency determination and complete their FAFSA, which is kind of a burdensome process. So the good news is that next year, the FAFSA will debut something called provisional independent status, meaning that students can go ahead and submit their FAFSA indicating that they, again, have unusual circumstances such that they cannot provide parental information. And that FAFSA will be considered complete pending review by the financial aid office. So students can go ahead and get their student aid report without having to wait for that financial aid office to finish the dependency override request. So what will happen is that when a student submits their FAFSA indicating the provisional independent student status, that triggers the school to have to reach out to that student to give them the information about how to complete the process to get that dependency override finalized. So again, this is an improvement over this year. This year, students still have to affirmatively reach out to financial aid offices to ask for the dependency override, but next year there will be a process through which colleges will be able to reach out directly to students who have indicated that they need a dependency override in order to provide them information about how to proceed. And I will turn it back to Barbara.
Okay, so a couple more pieces that we are previewing that will go into effect that are not in effect now, but for next year. One has to do with what the question on homelessness on the FAFSA actually looks like. As you know, currently there are 3 questions that are asked that can be confusing based on where a young person may have gotten a determination. In the future and for next year, the Department of Education will be required to have a single simplified FAFSA question. It has to be a question that is easily understood screening question to identify students who are unaccompanied, experiencing homelessness in youth, or unaccompanied, at risk, and self-supporting. Also, and this is really important, again, as I mentioned, in terms of the financial aid administrator's determination, that question has to be distinct from the questions that are relating to students who don't have access to parental income due to an unusual circumstances. Really important that we separate these two categories, and can be confusing because a lot of reasons that are listed under provisional independence that Jasmine talked about, trafficking, being abandoned, being neglected, having a parent who's incarcerated, are also the reasons why young people are experiencing homelessness. So we really want to emphasize with this new question, it'll be important to do a lot of educating about that definition of homelessness and that it's something different. It's a streamlined process. So again, this year, the FAFSA looks the same. Next year, we'll see big changes with this single question. And next slide, I believe, is we're going to take a break here and ask what questions you have. We're going to do a little bit of talk about resources, but we know this is a lot of information. As I mentioned in the beginning, any implementation of a new policy as far-reaching as this one, there will be a lot of training, a lot of tools that will be needed, and a lot of implementation questions that we can't even now predict. So just want to take the temperature and ask you what guidance and tools you think you will need to help implement these new policies.
So as we're waiting to hear some of your ideas for guidance and tools, we can go ahead and answer a few questions that we have prompted to answer live. So our first question was, what if a student status changes during the year? And I think this question was asked during when a student, when Bryce, when you're talking that a student would presume to be independent for the following years, what if their status has changed? What would the student need to do?
Yeah, great question. If a student's status has changed between their award years, they can go ahead and indicate that on the FAFSA, saying that that status is no longer applicable to them. That might be beneficial to the student if, for example, they don't want to go through with a determination process or don't need to provide any additional information and might be otherwise classified as an independent student, but a student has that option to do so, to change that. If it's in the middle of an award year and a student's enrolled in higher education and their status changes, they also have the option to notify their financial aid administrator that their status has changed. But they're not required to do so. This is a process that is determined on an award year basis. So the student would, in general, wait until the following award year to indicate that a change had occurred.
And I'll just jump in too and say sometimes a student's status as an unaccompanied youth experiencing homelessness might change to an unaccompanied youth who's at risk of experiencing homelessness and self-supporting. So they may still be eligible. Just to consider, we're talking, at least in the homelessness category, about current homelessness or homelessness after July 1st of the award year, but also that at-risk and self-supporting category can be helpful for young people who may be not homeless anymore, but still be in a tough, risky situation that puts them at risk.
Thank you. And then another question that we had, and first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Debbie, for answering these questions in the background. You have been doing an amazing job. We have one person asking, is it a requirement that financial aid offices or higher ed institutions be trained on these new law changes and also make concerted effort to identify homeless unaccompanied students similar to K through 12?
I can take a first stab at that question, Jillian. It is unfortunately not a requirement that institutions of higher education be trained, but we know that a lot of the folks on this webinar today are tuning in specifically because they want to learn about these changes. And I think there's going to be further opportunities for a lot of the folks who can make it a reality for the students who are most impacted and can most benefit from these fixes to get trained on some of the changes. We're in touch with the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, who regularly puts out information about major changes in financial aid guidance and statute and practice. They've been closely following implementation of the FAFSA Simplification Act. And they have option for financial administrators to get certified on different rules and regulations applicable to the financial aid office. But it, as you, I think, implied from your question, it really is a whole community and whole school responsibility to make sure that these students have the resources and information they need, because it might not just be the financial aid office that a student goes to with questions. And it's also incumbent upon all of the parties who can authorize and verify a student's status as a student who is an unaccompanied homeless youth, or self-supporting and at risk of homelessness, to make sure that they are also providing the documentation that they are able to.
And I would just say, for those of you who are doing professional development within your own states or within your own school districts, the basics, whether it's foster care educational provisions, juvenile justice, or McKinney-Vento, this is now a new section to add to your PowerPoints and to your trainings, and to invite new friends to your trainings as well, because there's going to be a lot of work to get the word out and educate.
Great. And we are loving the different tips and different guidance you are putting in the Q&A. So thank you. Keep them coming. Another question that we have is, so just want to clarify again, although the student status will carry over to the new FAFSA, do they need to provide any other documentation again for that new school year to start to prove that they are an unaccompanied homeless youth?
I'll answer this again, not to hog the airtime here, but no, a student does not need to provide documentation again. And this is, again, one of the biggest and best parts of the statutory change. A student is presumed to have that same status going into the next year and does not need to provide any additional documentation. Unless the school notices some sort of conflicting information, they may then ask the student to provide it. But if there's nothing conflicting, and usually there is not, then the student status carries forward, and the student and the financial aid administrator cannot ask the student to provide additional documentation if there is nothing conflicting. Additionally, a lot of these students have experienced challenges with paperwork getting lost in the financial aid office, or previous, written statements and so forth that have not maybe been kept, or maybe there's been change in staff turnovers. Of course, all organizations and institutions are dealing with that. But institutions of higher education have a legal requirement to keep all documentation related to a student's financial aid for 3 years after the last date of enrollment. So a student who leaves higher education next summer, those records need to be on file still 3 years afterwards. So any student who's coming in with a determination that was of homelessness or other status that was made last year definitely still needs to have that documentation still on file. Otherwise, the school would not be in compliance with federal record keeping law.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Another question that we have is in regards to dependency overrides. If the student's parent is claiming them on their taxes, but the student doesn't actually have contact with the parent, will this qualify as a dependency override? This is something that this person sees quite a lot.
So this is a little bit difficult because, again, dependency overrides are a case-by-case judgment. So I can't tell you, yes, in all cases, this circumstance is going to be qualify, yes, and no, in all cases, this is not going to qualify. So I think in this situation, what I would advise is to provide, work with that young person to gather documentation showing proof that that young person has not been in contact with their parents, and that the parent is not supporting them. So examples of places you could go would be, a third party sort of teacher, a counselor, if there's a social worker involved, any of those kinds of folks would be really helpful. You, depending on your role, might be a person who's able to provide a statement corroborating that student's circumstances. If there's any kind of other documentation that anything that's written, text messages, emails, or whatever, that would be able to confirm that that young person has not been in contact with their parents, you want to have that together to be able to submit, because what the financial aid office is going to have to do is they'll probably be weighing some of the evidence, right? So they'll have this evidence here that says this young person is being claimed on their taxes by their parent, and that might be something that would weigh against considering them as an independent student. But on the other hand, I have all of this evidence from all these other people that's showing that that young person, despite the fact that they're being claimed on taxes, has really not been in contact with that parent. So I don't know if that's helpful. I'm sorry that I can't just say yes, no, but really when you're working with students and you're in these kind of weird situations where you have, a parent may be continuing to claim a student, but the student is like, hey, like I haven't lived with them for a couple of years. They kicked me out. They said I couldn't come back, et cetera. What you need to be doing is really helping that student gather documentation that shows their side of the story, so that the financial aid administrator has something they can use to make that decision, so that that student can be considered independent.
Great. And so I know we have a few more pieces here that we want to share, but know that we'll have a few more minutes at the end for more questions. But just want to turn it back over to Barbara and Bryce just to kind of sum up, like, what do we need to know after watching this webinar?
Okay, so most important piece is that the 23-24 FAFSA is available now. The questions may look the same, but these provisions that we've gone over are in effect now. So even on the homeless side anyway, in foster care, the changes are in effect now that we've gone over. The status does not need to be redetermined. So the question that Bryce answered so eloquently is we don't need to be re-traumatizing young people, asking about their status and asking them to get paperwork anymore. Number 3, these determinations must be made as quickly as practicable. 4, more programs and officials can authorize unaccompanied homeless youth status. So I would encourage you to look at who meets those eligible entities in your community, who are your college access programs, who are your programs who are serving homeless individuals that regardless of how they get funded, those are now parties that can make these determinations as well. And remember, for students who cannot get the determination, financial aid administrators must make the determinations for homeless and foster youth following the processes. It's not professional judgment. It is a determination that they have to make. So those are the 5 big takeaways. And on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about what's going to happen in Congress next year. I'll turn it back over to Bryce.
Thank you. The good news is that we have additional changes and simplification that are on the way. I'm going to divide this into conversation with Barbara on what is going to happen between the U.S. Department of Education and the administration and what things we expect Congress to be working on related to these youth. First, as I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, we are hopefully going to see the department fully implement the rest of the changes from the FAFSA Simplification Act by the end of, or actually will be the beginning of the 24-25 award year. Just to make sure folks understand, that is the FAFSA that goes online next fall. So October 1st, 2023 is the FAFSA that's applicable for the 24-25 award years. We're less than a year away from a dramatically simplified form that we'll have before right now is a little over 100 questions, moving down significantly to just a little under 40 questions in total, particularly removing questions that were what a student would have been required for students to answer related to their assets. And then part of the biggest changes from the FAFSA Simplification Act are related to financial aid eligibility and the formulas that are used to determine a student's aid. Under current law, roughly 2/3, about 63% of students end up qualifying for the maximum Pell Grant Award. The rest receive a partial Pell Grant Award or no Pell at all. That will rise significantly. So over the Department of Education projects over 80% of students will be eligible for maximum Pell as a result of filing the FAFSA, which means that the students who are experiencing homelessness or former foster youth are also more likely to be eligible for additional aid once they do fill out the form. So it's even better for them to make sure they fill out this process, fill out the form, and go through the financial aid process, even though it can be complicated for them. Roughly speaking, about more than 500,000 students nationwide will gain access to the program overall, and about 1.7 million students will see their awards go up to the maximum level. So some pretty substantial improvements to the overall financial aid process. And this is regardless of what might happen with congressional funding for the Pell Grant program. This is just literally how the actual formulas related to the programs that exist now will result in students' ability to draw down what has already been funded by the federal. And then in Congress, things are a little bit more murky. Obviously, we all know the results of congressional elections now, and Senate Democrats will retain control of the Senate, whereas the House will flip to Republican control. Generally speaking, reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, so some of the changes that are not included in the FAFSA Simplification Act, but have long been talked about related to student access and success and affordability, are not likely to move forward, in our opinion. Divided Congress makes achieving this kind of consensus very challenging, particularly as the parties have very different ideas related to higher education. But that doesn't mean that anything will happen to the financial aid programs. They will continue on. They're implicitly authorized by the fact that Congress funds the Pell Grant and SEOG and work study and all of the other programs that exist. So reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, although it's not likely to happen anytime soon, also doesn't really result in a direct or negative impact on students and families, at least a significant one. And like we've talked about today, there have been a lot of changes that have happened that have already benefit and will be benefiting students in the very near future. We are likely to see our congressional advocates who support students at risk of homelessness or experiencing homelessness and foster youth continue their work, and I will turn it over to Barbara to describe some of those actions that we expect.
So part of the reason I wanted to preface that sometimes advocacy takes a long time, but it's important to stick with it, is because these FAFSA Simplification Act changes were part of a bill called the Higher Education Access and Success for Homeless and Foster Youth, HESFI, and they did make it into a final bill. The financial aid pieces were taken from that legislation, put it into appropriations bill. Now they are law. Now they're going into effect. But there were other recommendations and other changes that need to happen in higher education for young people from foster care, young people experiencing homelessness that are still in that legislation. Things like requirement to have a higher education liaison or point of contact who can do a lot of this, the counterpart to the K-12 person in terms of helping students navigate higher education, having plans for housing, a priority for work study, many other pieces that are really important for these populations to be able to persist and achieve their higher education dreams. So we do expect that legislation to be reintroduced. It's historically been bipartisan. We will want to keep it bipartisan as we move forward in the House and the Senate. And that then becomes the focus of our advocacy, because whenever higher education does move, we then have a bill that we can show support for. So stay tuned for that. Some changes in the political makeup of those committees. But again, we have bipartisan support and we'll continue to work on that. The other piece that might happen at the end of the year, it might be another Christmas miracle, Christmas gift, is a legislation called the Housing for Homeless Students Act. This is legislation that would amend the low-income housing tax credit so that young people who've been homeless and unaccompanied in the past 7 years could both live in low-income housing and be a full-time student. That's really critical to not have to choose between housing and higher education. That one was just introduced a couple of weeks ago, reintroduced. So perhaps we'll see it at the end of a year bill again, with the stars are aligned, but if not, it'll be reintroduced and we'll move forward. And I will turn over the last bullet back over to Bryce to talk about Pell.
Thanks. And just a note that there is a lot of uncertainty related to congressional funding as usual for the federal financial aid programs. Right now, Congress is actively debating whether or not they will be able to reach agreement on an omnibus funding vehicle for the fiscal year 2023 period. One of the issues in play is whether or not there would, if there were to be an agreement on an overall bill, whether there would be an increase in the Pell Grant. The bills proposed in House and Senate would be roughly $400 or $500 increase in the Pell Grant to match with inflation. But if Congress cannot reach agreement on that and has to do, for example, a full year continuing resolution, then the Pell Grant would remain at its current level of $6,895. However, if Congress does reach agreement, and then even through the period of the next 2 years with divided government, there are some possibilities that Congress might continue to be able to provide some standard increases to financial aid. It has long been a bipartisan priority to adequately fund the Pell Grant, and in previous years, Congress has been able to reach some bipartisan consensus on making some incremental increases to financial aid each year. So it's possible that while we won't see a reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, we might continue to see little tweaks and little new investments in our student financial aid programs funded at the federal level. And of course, with 50 different states, states might also be making changes to their financial aid programs or improving their financial aid awards. Hopefully, as it came up, I believe, in the chat, we will see also more states also aligning their financial aid processes and their financial aid applications, if they have their own, for example, for undocumented students or even for supplemental state awards, making those aligned with federal policy.
All right. Well, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing this information. We have a few minutes left for answering a few questions, but also just wanted to put our contact information here as well as our resources. You will all get a copy of this recorded webinar as well as this PowerPoint deck, but we have just a few minutes left for some last lingering questions. We have listed here one of our questions: if someone wants to code a student as an unaccompanied homeless youth, but does this mean that they must have no contact or support from their parent or legal guardian? This question has come up a few times.
So there's no. So the definition of homelessness is the definition of homelessness. Unaccompanied means not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. It has nothing to do with they still have some contact. We know young people's family situations are very complex, and sometimes there is contact either with a parent who is the reason they're homeless or with a parent who wasn't homeless, but it doesn't matter. It's look at the legal definitions of homeless, the legal definition of unaccompanied, and there's no piece in that for whether they have contact with their parents.
Great. And so I know as we are rounding out the end of this year, for next year, we want to continue to provide various professional development opportunities. I know we'll probably be doing a lot more webinars. We want to feature financial aid administrators that are doing this work directly with our student population. So definitely keep an eye out for that. We'll turn it back over to our panelists. Are there any last words or anything else that you want to share to our group before we close out?
I'll share one thing. First, just a note of intense thanks for this entire community of those who, my co-panelists and those who have been part of advocating for students experiencing homelessness and foster youth over the years. That is what absolutely led to the changes that Congress was able to negotiate and pass in 2020, and is what is motivating the U.S. Department of Education and our champions across the administration on the Hill to make these changes a reality. The Hope Center will be working with our partners here on this call on implementation, following it very closely and trying to provide as many updates as we can. For example, as we've talked about, the FAFSA itself is outdated for now. Some of the help text articles online are not yet updated, but we are in active communication to make sure that those get resolved and simplified as quickly as possible. And also that hopefully we might even be able to see some additional separate clarifying guidance specific to the population of students experiencing homelessness and former foster youth, so that it's easy to Google or look up on the FSA Center what exactly needs to be done to help this particular population of students. And welcome everyone who is interested in joining our effort in that regard. Thank you all so much for having me today.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.